Yep. Hello, everyone. It's nice to see that everybody got up today. um, so, as I have already said, my name is Yevgen. I'm working in a company that's called MobiDev, and a short brief about my background. It's about 10 years in web development. Only 4 of them are with Ruby. Other years I spent with PHP. That's why I have experience in different ecosystems except Ruby. And about 3 years I also worked closely with Trailblazer, so I like a little bit exotic approaches to Ruby application development. For sure, as most Rubyists right now, I'm like in love with Elixir and all the ecosystem, and I'm in very complicated relationship with Ruby on Rails and blockchain. So don't ask me about blockchain. Recent 1.5 year, I'm architecting a solution of one big application, and as you understand, it is made with Hanami. And actually, yesterday I thought that everyone is posting the pictures with dogs. This is my cute dog, so it should make you feel so, I don't know, so sweet. And now move on to our topic. First of all, who have ever made applications with Hanami? Please raise your hands. Oh, that's nice. Actually, it's really nice. And who has ever done something in production? So not just playing around, but something with. That's not so good, but at least one, yeah. Great. And as I understand, okay, who heard about Hanami? So and understand at least a little bit that what Hanami is. Okay, so brief introduction. So Hanami aims to be a full-featured framework, similar to Rails, let's call it, and it has all the things you expect a web framework to have inside. So I wouldn't, I don't know, pronounce all of these things, and we will see a little bit later what we really have and what we don't have. Actually, what's wrong with Rails? Why this question really appeared to me to switch to some other framework? First of all, I don't like those sharp knives that are provided by Rails and that are advertised by David Heinemeier Hansen. A lot of monkey patching, all the active support stuff. It's really discussionable question about is it good or not. I'm those person who don't like a lot of things that that pollute your application with a lot of monkey patchings. And of course, our biggest issue is fat controllers, fat models, fat views, and really the whole applications became your business logic. That's the standard Rails way that we are being taught by all the manuals, by all the books, by the framework as it provides such workflow. I also not fond of this approach, and that led me to find another ways to build applications. And also, as I have said, I came to Ruby from PHP, and PHP had much more different frameworks with really different approaches to building applications. So for me, it was like more natural to search for something different. And what I also don't like is, I call it like Rails deformation, is that developers tend to put all the business entity and business logic to the active record model, and they think that if this business entity doesn't fit to the active record, then they're doing something wrong. And they're trying to modify their business logic to follow active record approach. And that's really not how applications should be done. You should do it really in reverse order. Active record is just a tool that you should use or not. So what Hanami proposes to, let's say, solve these issues, or at least to be a little bit different, Hanami proposed was to container architecture. So a native way to divide your applications in a smaller one, to keep it inside one code base, but to allow them to be really more flexible in configuration. Also, it provides different structure for common code like library, so this lib directory that we have even in Rails, but also it separates common code from application-specific code. Another approach is that to create a separate class per each action that also a little bit an overhead, but allows to configure your actions more granularly. It has like service object inside. I will talk about it a little bit later. The biggest difference is that Hanami proposes not active record approach to work with a database, but entity repository approach. We will also talk about in more details about good pros and cons of this approach. So, dry gems inside and being completely free from active support pollution of your application. So being honest, in our application we created only a couple of methods like empty and present, something like this. So only 2 methods from active support we just re-implemented in our application for just for convenience. So the question, I think that you all expect from me to answer the question: is Hanami really good? I would really say yes, it's good. If you would say, do I really enjoy? I would say for sure I'm really enjoying. And like summary, do you really propose everyone to get rid of Rails and start using Hanami right now? And I would say, I don't know. It's really a really doubtful question. It would be, I would lie to you if I would say that you should really start using Hanami right now because it solves all your problems. Some problems are being solved, but a lot of new problems really arises, and we will talk about it later in this talk. First of all is the price, as I call it, like price of being non-mainstream, of using non-mainstream solution. I would say that in different aspects it took about a couple of months, let's say 3 months, for our team to really start being productive. So of course we did a lot of investigations. We did a lot of pet projects, small pet projects, and some, I don't know, very small specific investigations. But when we started, and we understood that yes, Hanami would suit our needs and it works. But when we started to do really big projects, we understood that we haven't found even, I don't know, a half of issues. Of course, you can't hire Hanami developer. It's just impossible. So I do not even say to our recruiters like, find me a Hanami developer. They just find me a good Ruby developer who is willing to change something in his life. And we need to educate all the new team members. But I think that they enjoy this education. It's the very beginning. It's a little bit strange for most Rubyists, but then they get used to Hanami way. Also, it's quite tough to integrate existing Ruby code, Ruby gems. Not all of them has examples how to integrate it in non-Rails environment, so you need to read the code, you need to understand how to do something in non-Rails. And that's another question, that Rails-ish ecosystem is a little bit depressing because 2/3 of gems, maybe half of the gems are made solely for Rails, and you cannot use them without Rails at all. And another half is, there is a lack of documentation how to use it without Rails, or it has, for some reason, it has a dependency for active model or active support, and it's pretty hard to distinguish what gem you really can use and what you can't use. And other question is the lack of documentation. So yeah, Hanami has quite a great guide. It has, so you would understand how to work with the framework, but when you start doing some real application, you see, okay, where is examples? I want to see how people really do, how they write code. Okay, it's a Rails guy for sure. And how they write code, how they implement something with Hanami, it was a huge issue actually for me. So that's why I started to do this. It's called Hanami Cookbook. You can find it by this link. I'm trying to put all the experience and I don't know, actually things that we have implemented. I'm trying to extract it and anonymize this implementation, and to put this into structured cookbook. So it's how to add a sidekick, how to add, you know, Trailblazer, how to use any kind of gems that are needed. Today I will cover most of needed things that are described in the Hanami cookbook. Especially I didn't put a code into this presentation because I don't like reading codes from the slides. You would be able to read code in the Hanami cookbook. It's still in progress. Try as much as possible to put information there. It's still a lot to add, and I would try to do it in nearest months, hopefully, to finalize everything that could be needed for general purpose application. So let's start. As I have said, all my experience is about 1.5 years working with quite a big project. To understand how big this project is, and for you to measure, I tried to do the statistics. So it's about 140 API actions. It's single-page application with REST API, actually. So that's why a little bit specific application. It's not a standard Rails application. It uses very small amount of view rendering. It mostly renders JSON responses. But it has a lot of non-CRUD business logic. It's about 350 operations. So in about 50 models, entities, repositories, and 6 different databases. So I would also tell a little bit why we need so much. So let's start. My first question to the Hanami was, okay, I would start application. I for sure would do it with Trailblazer, because I've done, for the 3 years before that, I've done all the Rails applications with Trailblazer. It's also like discussable question, is Trailblazer really good or not? For me, it really saved us a couple of times when we refactored really old Rails apps, and it was like a savior thing. So with Hanami, we use only one piece of Trailblazer, is Trailblazer operation. The problem is that Trailblazer is it appeared that Trailblazer is very specific to modernizing Rails application, and it has a lot of nice things to, like macroses that are aimed to work with active record. And when you start putting it into Hanami, you understand that you can just, I don't know, 50% of Trailblazer is useless for you in Hanami application. It's just, there is just no such an issues that Trailblazer solves in Rails. So it's good and it's maybe bad. So we've done validation via pure dry validation. It appears that Hanami validation maybe just a little bit overhead because it used completely dry validation inside. So why shouldn't we use dry validation directly? It appears that Hanami interactor, it's like a service object that exists in Hanami. It's very simplistic, and it was not enough for us because Trailblazer implements Railway programming approach. When you have 2 tracks, like successful track and failure track, it's very convenient, and we decided to leave it and do not use Hanami interactors. And the documentation for Trailblazer is still also not very good. It's sometimes problematic. It was really problematic for me, for example, to write a custom macros. So because macroses allow to share common operation codes between operations, and there are quite a lot of macroses that already pre-exist for Rails application, but for Hanami we have written our own macroses, and it was not so easy to find. But for sure you can find this receipt in Hanami cookbook right now. Then I started experimenting. So we need to do a REST API. So we have a logic. It is inside Trailblazer operation. So for API, we did a separate container application. So we have, as I call it, like a launcher page that is like that renders layout, renders HTML, and this launcher page it's a separate container app, and it launches single page application written in Vue.js. and then this Vue.js application communicates to the REST API. So we have turned it off for this REST API application, all the templates, layouts, all the things. We use Trailblazer representable. It's a gem to serialize your entities, your models, and to output them. It works very well. And what our actually controllers actions in Hanami do is just call in operations, receive result from operation, and render JSON from representable. So we have really tiny, it's usually 3 lines of code in each action. And we use JWT authentication for the REST API. I would tell about authentication on the next slide. The only thing with implementing REST API in Hanami was just not really straightforward JSON rendering. You see this code at the bottom of the screen. So I wanted just to render the output and end the request. And actually, as I remember, in Rails, you also need to do the same hack. You need to use halt. And I find it a little bit hacky because all the framework still tries. So when you already have prepared your output and you want just to stop there, they still try to render something or to do something else. But I want just to halt the execution here and output what we have. About authentication, I just implemented a login, registration login. There is no out-of-the-box solution for Hanami, and this is one of the major blockers, I think, for adoption of the Hanami. There are a couple of topics on the Hanami forum where people are discussing what they actually can use. There are some couple of semi-made solutions, similar, people trying to do something similar to device. Particularly, I do not find device as really good solution for authentication. So for our applications, we were lucky. We needed to implement authentication only via API, and JWT was enough for us. We didn't need to. So all the other things like two-factor authentications, registration, etc., we implement manually. We just have written the code. We have written the operations that receive data from user and create it, validate 2FA. Yeah, we have written additional code. Maybe with Rails, we would be able not to write this code. But that's the price you need to pay. You need to write more code with Hanami, for sure. But the good thing is that you control this code to 100%. Because those people who try to modify how device behave, they know that sometimes you just want to write your custom code and forget about device. So here we didn't have this issue because we just write our code. And we implemented for the very first iteration quite naive implementation of JWT. Now we switched to JWT sessions gem, and it's really good. It's not especially for Hanami, just a general purpose gem, but it implements quite secure, it's a framework that's reliable and secure to handle JWT with refresh tokens, with CSRF tokens. So really have a look on this. And yeah, for cookie-based authentications for no API apps, I think it's still to come, some solution for Hanami. Then we use single-page application with JavaScript. Of course, we need somehow to handle Webpack. So Rails has Webpacker. And I do not understand why Rails has such a feature, a Webpacker, because in reality, you do not need almost nothing special. You just need a Webpack that works just so just a separate application for this Webpack application that packs your JavaScript and CSS. And also in our team, we have a team of front-end developers. And these front-end developers, they want to do everything by themselves. And I'm very happy with this. And I just say, okay, front-end developers, you have your Webpack, you do all the configurations you need. You do not need to bother with how to add your custom configuration to Rails, Webpacker, etc. I just have couple of classes in our application. This class is just parses Webpack manifest file. Another class create couple of helpers like JavaScript pack tag and spreadsheet or CSS pack tag, and it just handled small configuration with environment variable to use Webpack dev server or not to use. And it's about like 30 lines of code, and that's it. And this works because you need it only for development, you don't need it for production. It gives us, as I have said, like happy front-end developers, happy me, because I do not need to find hacky solutions how to modify Webpacker, and you really think about it because maybe you not need very heavyweight solution to handle Webpack. Okay. Another thing that all we need is, of course, Sidekick, because I think almost any Ruby application doesn't work without background job processing, and we wanted to understand how can I use Sidekick with Hanami. You can just use the game Sidekick and that's it. You don't need anything to do special. You don't need active job or something. You just use Sidekick worker classes, and they're working out of the box. Just a small example how you can run Sidekick also as a separate process in config boot.rb. Also a couple of lines of codes like Hanami boot, and that's it. So you require environment, you say Hanami boot, and all the Sidekick workers have Hanami environment inside. So they can use all the code that you use in Hanami repositories, entities, etc. So this is one of the things that worked almost without any adjustment. Now, let's go to more interesting things. So Hanami repository is class that operates with database. So inside the repository, you have methods to access data, to write data from database. When you start looking at it, I think from Hanami 1 point something, they have remade and switched from SQL inside the repository. They have switched to GrillRB. It's like a good move because GrillRB is very powerful library, but when you try to work with it, my general impression, I just understand how it works. Documentation about repositories in Hanami guide are very, I don't know, very brief, very brief. It's just about very simplistic operations like find, update, etc. It doesn't state clearly what to do with more complicated things like joins, or, I don't know, aggregations and others. Also, it inherits terminology from GrillRB, for example, like aggregate. So yes, when you working with GrillRB, when you try to understand GrillRB philosophy, because GrillRB tries to be like database agnostic library for data manipulation, and that's why it lacks our usual relational database terminology. It tries to abstract everything, but when you work with this, you understand that you are like you are not productive with all these abstractions. You do not understand what you're really doing. It's very hard to translate to yourself how and what to do. Very hard to find documentation. Also, current version of Hanami uses the ROM, I think, 3rd version. It's already has 5th version. When we were working with it, basic documentation to GrillRB was for version number 4, and it took us a couple of weeks to understand that we are looking on the wrong documentation version. We were looking on the documentation for the version 4, but inside the Hanami we had GrillRB number 3, and it was mind-blowing. So we were very frustrated because of that, really very frustrated. Also, it has a luck. It supports only one database connection. It's not about GrillRB, it's about Hanami. Hanami repository is made to support only one database connection, that's all. A big surprise for me was that I cannot make nested entities. You know, like when user has user profile, and maybe inside user profile I have array of authentication records, etc. It doesn't allow to me to get all of this inside one like entity, and inside this entity you have another entities. It gives you just hashes inside. You need to map it custom, I know, some manually. Also, custom mapping is not really working. I wasn't able, for example, to use, I don't know, user repository, but actually user table, but to create special active user repository, because active user repository tries to use active user table automatically. And there is no documentation how to change it. Now I know how to change it, but I know it only when I have read all the code of the Hanami repository. Now I understand how it could be done. So what we did with it, we worked with GrillRB for about 6 months, and after that we decided to do this. It's very controversial decision. It was not easy for us, so we used active record. I was so glad at the very beginning when I said that active record is bad, and now we are back to active record. Now I want to say you that it's not active record is bad. Active record is just a pattern. Rails active record is not very good, but active record by itself, as when you use it solely to manipulate the data, to read and to write data, and do not put any kind of business logic validation and other crazy stuff, it's maybe the best thing ever invented for the web development, because it has very fluent interface, and SQL is, I don't know, SQL has everything you need to work with relational databases, with Postgres particularly. Then what we did, we just have written our own repository. We call it like SQL repository or something, and we have a convention: use model actions only inside the repository. So when you do a code review, if you see that somebody used something like save, update, or find somewhere else not in repository, you just can say you did it wrong, and very clear rule. So we still have this sharp knife. Unfortunately, I haven't found the way how to limit the scope, like to say. I thought that maybe with some refinement, I can monkey patch and block all the save, find, update actions for models, and to all of them only inside the repository class. But I wasn't succeeded with this, so we decided just to go on convention. And also another good thing is that SQL module is active record, but we have an access to raw data manipulation with data sets. So data sets give us like 100% free to make any kind of very efficient queries. It's also very easy to write like huge and complicated raw SQL queries, and that was not so easy with GrillRB, by the way. The only things where we got issues when we run in production with Puma, with multi-threaded environment, we need to do this database disconnect on before fork. It also took us a couple of days to understand why why after deployment to the test server we are exhausting all the connections in a couple of minutes, because GrillRB handles this automatically, but we needed to do this manually in Puma configuration. So about databases, we use a lot of different purpose databases. So Postgres for general purpose data, almost all data is in Postgres. Redis for the sidekick mostly, but we have a couple of things like trending, some trending calculations, and these trends we keep in the Redis, because Redis has efficient data types for this. In FluxDB we are using for time series data. It's like prices, so we have like price tickers. Also Cassandra we use to store posts. We have ability to do a lot of posts in our application, so a lot of users can do a lot of posts, so we store that in Cassandra. We have actually something similar to Twitter-like social network. That's why we need graphs to have threads, threads of conversation. When you have a lot of branches of conversation, you need to store it in the graph. And we used Janus Graph as graph database. And Algolia is like a service. It's very similar to Elastic, but we use it for search. So we index our data to the Algolia for full text search. And all of this data, let's say data storages, are wrapped with their own kind of repositories. So we have written just a special class that implement basic functions like find, update, delete, etc. for all of this kind of data, all of this kind of databases. And we do not invent anything really special. We just use like native gems or SDKs that exist for this database in Ruby, and we just put plain requests, not unified plain requests to these SDKs and database clients inside the repositories. So we just hidden all the database communication, real low-level database communication under the repositories. So our application, business logic of our application just calls meaningful repositories with meaningful methods and doesn't bother itself with real implementation. Where do we really store this data? How do we retrieve it? I do not say that this approach would allow us to, let's say, to swap the databases really fluently, because we still have methods that are a little bit database related, but it would be much easier to swap the databases if needed. So we have actually, I would say, what we did. We migrated parts of the data from Postgres to Cassandra, for example, and it was quite easy. We also plan to migrate search, for example, from Algolia to pure Elasticsearch, and I'm sure that it would be like maybe 1 week of work, but not months. What else do we use is dry container plus dry auto inject. If you are not really familiar, what is this? It's approach to have like dependency injection container inside the application. We use it to mostly to have like a single entity of clients. For example, InfluxDB client, we just register InfluxDB client in this container. We have only one instance, and so we do not need to bother ourselves of how do we handle this pool of connections, and so we do not recreate a lot of connections, etc., etc. It also works pretty nice. Also, we register repositories, because why do we do this registration of repositories? Because in Hanami, you need to instantiate repository. You cannot say just post repository find. You need to say post repository new find. So find is the method of the instance, and it also, so it is made for purpose. It is made for purpose of ability to do this dependency injection, actually, because not to use a singletons inside, but we are able to make something in repository initializer. It is not needed for, I would say, 90% of cases, but we really use some cases when we need to do something when we initialize the repository. Mostly it's like to inject for Influx, for example, we need to inject Influx client inside. And it also helps us, and registration of repositories also help us to keep only one copy of repository for the whole runtime. And do not spend memory and CPU for instantiating repositories, the same repositories, every time. Another thing you need for the application is cache. Hanami, for some reason, doesn't have native cache implementation. I'm not sure did we do it right or not, but so of course for cache we use Redis. It's first solution. It's very efficient. Very low memory footprint. I was searching for something in terms of Ruby implementation, something very similar to active support cache implementation with just a pure methods like fetch, I don't know, put, just a couple of methods. I have found that there is a gem that is called read this cache. It really implements all what we need, and it's not Rails related. We were very lucky. We used read this cache inside, but what we did, we also thought about, okay, how would we handle cache? And I decided that as cache is also a data source, I would rather put cache in the repository, in the cache repository. So now we have, for some entities, we have, for example, posts repository and posts cache repository. Post cache repository doesn't implement the whole set of methods. It just implements those methods that are needed to be cached. So we decided to leave it in such way to still be able to call cache repository when needed and to call pure post repository. And we can be sure that we read from the database without any kind of cache manipulations. And what we did inside the cache repository, we just wrap the call to the database repository with the cache. And this method cache ID that you can see here, it's just any arbitrary method where you calculate the string, and the string would be the cache key. So that's it in general. Then the question appeared, how to run everything in production. Okay, documentation says how to run development mode, but it doesn't say anything how to run Hanami in production. And okay, I know for sure that I wanted to start with Puma, for example. Luckily, I was really lucky to find one example somewhere on the GitHub, I think from Anton Davidov, how he runs HANA application with Puma. It was my starting point. Actually, how to configure Puma. It appeared to be very, very similar to the Rails app, and the only thing you need to change is to have this on-worker boot. You need to call Hanami boot, but everything else is like standard Puma operation. What we just need to change a couple of environment parameters, like to change Hanami environment to production, and to say that you do not want to serve static assets in production. It's not obligatory, but we do not want to serve assets from Hanami. And just start your Hanami server with no code reloading. It would be much more efficient without reloading, of course. And I think that's it. So it would work. The only thing you would need also not to forget to do things like database disconnect, also in this Puma RB, as I have said previously about SQL. Then not so main things, but we decided to do, for example, database seed click command. So I started to look how to do a custom CLI command in Hanami. It appears that documentation doesn't have any information about it. I thought that, okay, we have standard Hanami commands like Hanami db create. It's standard Hanami CLI that exists. I wanted to find a way how can I inject my own commands like database seed. I don't know, maybe I was not lucky, but I didn't succeed how to do this. Then I found gem that is called Hanami CLI, as I remember. Yeah, gem Hanami CLI. I thought, oh, how I'm lucky, and then I'm reading description, and description says it's a general purpose CLI, not related to Hanami by itself. Okay. So actually we created second Hanami CLI launcher. As in documentation of Hanami CLI, we have just a separate bunch of classes with our own commands. So Hanami CLI by itself works pretty fine. I like how it works. I don't like only one thing, that I have these two launchers, two different launchers. And we need to remember that things like create I do with standard launcher, but seed I do with not standard. But mostly we are using, I think, not standard. So it's quite clear to understand when you do something related to your business logic, to your business domain, you call custom launcher. But when you do something related to framework by itself, you use standard launcher. It's not a big issue. As for testing, I want to say that everything works fine. So you can use everything that you use with your standard Rails application for testing. All the things like Capybara, Database Cleaner, VCR works, Minitest, RSpec works. Especially we use Minitest. It's because for some reasons, a lot of reasons, I was not liking like RSpec. It's also very discussionable question, but I think that in future we will migrate to RSpec in general, because currently Hanami has RSpec by default, but the version before this, it was Minitest by default yet. The only thing that we needed to change from standard thing is factory bot. Factory bot requires action support, active support, or action support. Maybe I think I've misspelled. So I do not want to have action support in any case in our application. So we were searching for solution and found Fabricator gem. So Fabricator is almost the same as factory bot, but it doesn't have unneeded dependencies. So it works with us. What we are testing, we are mostly testing Trailblazer operations, because all our logic is inside operations. So when we cover operations with test suite, we're 90% sure that everything works as expected. Also we have like external API tests, integrational test. But so Capybara also can work if needed. And in Hanami documentation, one of the first things you would find is examples when they test Hanami actions. So Hanami action is a class, and you can just test the output of call method of Hanami action. It's really cool. It looks very nice, but in reality, I do not think it's really worth doing. Because when you have if you wrap everything in operations, you do not need to test Hanami actions. Actually, testing Hanami actions supposes that you put your logic into the controller. So it teaches you the wrong things, I think. So we do not do this, and maybe you shouldn't also. Then other things that needed for any application is authorization to check, for example, can user create or delete something. Almost anything can be used, like Pandit, etc. We have used gem from Evil Martians that is called action policy. It's very similar to Pandit, and the only thing we do not use is we do not use in the shortcut functions like authorize, etc. We do not authorize the permission in the controllers. We authorize the permission in operations or maybe wrapper operations. And you can see a piece of code from Trailblazer operation. It's step, for example, step check policy. If it would be failure, then it goes to the forbidden response code. And the check policy is just like calling policy class, putting all the dependencies of this policy, and checking can we create or not. Also, this could be wrapped in the custom macros of the Trailblazer if needed. But what I always search in gems when I want to integrate something in Hanami, I always search gems with good documentation of how to use it in bare Ruby without any kind of helper method, etc. I just want to see how to initialize some class, call some method, and have the result. So if documentation has something like this policy call, then I'm sure that I can do anything that is needed inside the application. Then we needed a WebSockets. And of course, Rails has any action cable. Action cable has, so for sure it's a good thing, but it has very doubtful performance. And have I said that Evil Martians are very good guys, and they have written like another implementation of action cable protocol, and they call it any cable. And luckily, any cable is not related to Rails in any way. It can be used without Rails. It's just general purpose application and gem. So any cable consists of two parts. Actually, any cable application written in Go. So there are two implementations in Go and Erlang. And you do not need to do anything with this Go or Erlang application. You just download it, for example, in Docker container. You just run it, and it runs and operates. You don't need to do anything. This application handles WebSocket connections. It handles very good concurrency, and for our application, we just pay for like couple of hundred of megabytes of RAM to handle all the connections of all the users. We have not much users, not very much, but for me it works pretty well. Another part is the Ruby part. It's Ruby gem called AnyCable. This Ruby gem implements a gRPC server that communicates to AnyCable Go, for example. So AnyCable Go and AnyCable Ruby, they're using common gRPC interface and communicate between each other. So when user connects to AnyCable Go would call gRPC function from AnyCable Ruby and would tell AnyCable Ruby that something is happening. I don't know, I have a new message, I have a new connection, and AnyCable Ruby handle it. So you run this as a separate also application, like you run a Sidekick, you would run AnyCable Ruby as a separate application. And to implement things that you know from Rails action cable, like channels and all the things, you need light cable gem. So light cable implement actually channels and broadcasting. And I think that's it for WebSocket. Actually, yeah, you can use, by the way, action cable JavaScript. So you don't need any special JavaScript. You just take npm package from action cable, and it works with any cable. And also, it has full API compatibility between any cable and action cable. So it's really cool gem, and it solves all our needs for WebSocket communication with Hanami also. But also we have a service communication, because we have a couple of, let's call it services or microservices. I would tell a little bit later what actually service do we have, but we decided to, it's service written, potentially our services would be written not only in Ruby, so we decided that Sidekick is not good to have to use a worker as a communication. So we decided to use some real message bus, so message broker. We used RabbitMQ, and our basic application just published some messages to the RabbitMQ, and another services consume and publish vice versa. Luckily, we also have good gem that is called Sneakers. The gem Sneakers is very similar to the Sidekick. Just consider it like a Sidekick, but it uses not Redis inside, but RabbitMQ. And it allows us to run also another separate process for Sneakers with Sneakers boot.rb. And as you, I think, understand, in this Sneakers boot.rb, we also have a Hanami boot that loads all the environment. At the bottom, it's like an example how can look this Sneakers worker. It's very similar to the Sidekick. The only difference is you need to call acknowledged or reject at the very bottom. So it doesn't, as you know, Sidekick considers that all jobs are successful if no exception was raised. But if exception is raised, then it was not successful. Here you need to acknowledge or reject manually. It's also like specifically to RabbitMQ, so who wants to understand how RabbitMQ works, I really suggest you to read about it. It's very cool technology. Now about services. As I have told you previously, Hanami allows you to have like a container apps. At the left side, you can see this folder apps. It's standard folder of Hanami, and it has standard Hanami apps like web, API, admin panel. All of these apps has like application RB, configuration, routing, etc. But what we also did, at the right side, you can see that API is almost standard application, but it's we have removed everything that is unneeded. If we do not need templates and views in API, I just removed it. And in configuration, I have set like layout false, etc. But also you can see at the right part, seems like Sidekick UI or Graph UI, and it has just arbitrary files like Docker file. So we also decided to reuse this applications folder to have apps that are not really Hanami related. So the Graph UI is just a Docker file that is used to build a container for Graph UI with a special image. So Sidekick UI is just configure that we use to launch a separate Puma process just to run this rec application for Sidekick UI. We decided that it's better to keep everything in one single repository as kind of mono repo, because we need all the things all the time. We do not want to to handle them separately. And it's pretty nice when you do not need just to put this Docker file somewhere at the root of your project, but you can find a special place where additional apps can live inside. Then I also promised to say something about non-standard or exotic usage of Hanami. And also yesterday, I think I was saying that I'm using GrillRB in production. Yeah, we are using GrillRB in production. We have application that listens to the WebSocket. So we are not like any cable or action cable when we are consuming we are WebSocket server. But now we need So for example, we have like price stickers, and we need to connect to some WebSockets and to receive a lot of information from the WebSockets inside our application. And now imagine that we need to create one separate WebSocket connection for each our user. So we will have hundreds or thousands of persistent WebSocket connections. I was thinking how to do this. Of course, as I love Elixir, I thought maybe let's use Elixir. But then I thought, okay, it's only me who knows Elixir in our team, so maybe it's a bad idea. So we decided to stick to Ruby implementation. Then I thought, okay, what can allow me to have a lot of separate threads? What would allow me to manage parallelism and in a better way? So of course I would need something like GrillRB to really use multiple threads, because GrillRB doesn't have a log for threads, and I would need something that would simplify management of threads. I used Celluloid. Unfortunately, the day I started using Celluloid was the day when the author of Celluloid say, okay, I've give up, I wouldn't support the gem anymore. Shit, it's really bad. But let's say Celluloid works. The current version of Celluloid is still alive, and so yeah, you need to tackle documentation a little bit, but it works. Then I understood that, okay, I would gather this information from WebSocket, a lot of informational threads. We gather it. Then we use those RabbitMQ message broker just to distribute it to our main application with main business logic to handle these notifications. But also we needed a couple of REST API actions just for diagnostical reasons. So we wanted to call our WebSockets listener and to understand how much threads launched, what is the consumption, I don't know, what is the best, what is the statistics. So in the future we would add Prometheus metrics. So we would need this service to respond to REST requests, just to HTTP requests. And I started to implement some very basic RAC application with very basic HTTP action handling. Then I understood, stop. I'm doing something very similar to Hanami. So why don't I just take Hanami parts like Hanami router, controller, and validation, and just put inside my application that is not general purpose web application, but some kind of another thing. And actually, I'm just starting a standard RAC application via config.ru. It launches a lot of things like Celluloid, dry system, etc. The supervisors is a class from Celluloid that manage all the business logic of supervising connection to WebSockets. And then at the very bottom, I do this run web, so just standard middleware call. Okay. And I have this very simplistic router. Okay, yeah, 1 second. Okay. So I have very simplistic Hanami router implementation and very simplistic Hanami action with parameters validation. And it gives me full power of real, let's say, Hanami actions, validations, etc., with all the error handling if needed, etc., etc., just without anything. I'm not sure. Maybe some other frameworks would also allow me to use such granular pieces of the framework, but I'm almost sure that with Rails I wouldn't be able to do this. So I would use the whole bundle or nothing. So with Hanami, it's easier. You can combine what you need, what you don't need. What about actually the future of Hanami? I forgot to mention at the very early, at the very beginning, I'm not affiliated with development of Hanami, so maybe for my shame, I'm not even participating in development, only maybe some communication in Twitter. But what I know about the future of Hanami, as you have seen, it's not ideal. So it has a lot of things yet to do to make it more perfect. The second version of Hanami is in progress right now. As I know, it is promised to do somewhere the autumn. I remember, to have maybe some beta release or something. There are some roadmaps. What would change is really so container management would change. As I understand, something similar to dry container would appear like as a core of Hanami. It would be more flexible configuration. I hope that it would allow multiple database connection by default. I really hope. It would have most of fresh dry gems. I'm still not sure that dry gems are always the best fit or best solution. Sometimes I find them a little bit esoteric. I even do not say anything about like dry monads or monads by themselves, but even things like dry validation are not so user-friendly, I would call. Not so. It's harder to understand what is happening and how to write it correctly without documentation and from the very beginning. But maybe just a matter of time to get used. Okay, and the final part of my talk is maybe explaining like some kind of ideal vision, how I see maybe how framework ideal for me should behave or how it should consist from what parts. And of course, in any Ruby meetup, we should mention Elixir Phoenix. I have mentioned a couple of times already, but I do not say that Elixir Phoenix is the best framework ever made, but I find it particularly well designed and it's quite good. So that's why I would compare current Hanami implementation and with potentially good implementations or decisions from Elixir Phoenix. So what I wanted to see from the framework is it should be very loosely coupled from different libraries. Hanami already has it to some way. I think it should be extended and should be even better. Because, for example, most PHP frameworks, they are really consist of granular small libraries inside, and there are even special frameworks that specially made to be very loosely coupled when you replace every particular piece of the framework with other implementation. I want to see full transparency of request from application server to router to action. So in Rails, for me, it was very hard to see where I can put my intermediary code in the request path. In Hanami, it's a little bit easier, but it's still not perfect. I think it could be better, at least, for example, to have like scoped roads when I apply some middleware to some scope of the roads. It would be also very nice. I want to see really more, not more flexible. I want to see flexible data mapper for sure, but maybe it could be even not an ORM. So because RomRB is actually like a data mapper, it's not an ORM by itself, but also RomRB sometimes a little bit esoteric. I want to see something in between, ideally. Something maybe that easier to understand, but still flexible. And what for sure, I do not want to see frameworks that is resource or CRUD oriented, as it is in Rails. Because most real applications, they are not about CRUD. So yeah, if you have like database browser, or I don't know, you're doing like admin when you need to just read or modify at list of user, yes, but for big apps like our, we have quite big app, and I'm for sure understand that Rails would just slow down us with resource orientation architecture. And I want to see basic DDD like structure of the folders and modules. Of course, to apply DDD in full scale, I would say it's very hard, but ideally framework should somehow point to this direction. As a general rule, I have this like sentence that framework should teach me to write better code and to do better architecture. That is ideally what I want to say, want to see in the framework. As an example, I want to show current Hanami, for example, folder structure. It's at the this violet square at the left is a structure of the application. of the web-facing app. So we have an assets, config, controllers, templates, views. It's all related to the web application, for example. We also can have the same API application. So we have like, I don't know, maybe, or an admin area application. And all of them, of course, reuse entities, like models like entities and repositories, some code operations. And this reusable code is put to the bottom, to the green part in the library folder. So this is what is good in Hanami. So they separate this library code that is reused between container applications, and at the top it's only like web-related code. Elixir Phoenix does something similar at my point of view. It also has, you see at the right side, this violet rectangle is the web part with controllers, channels, template views. At the top, it has a green with shared folder. At the very beginning, it's empty. But what is the difference? What is good in Elixir in current version of Phoenix? When you start, I've done a very simplistic scaffolding of couple of entities, like account users, comments, posts, and at the left is Hanami. Hanami puts in the folder library entities, it puts all the entities. At the repositories, we put all the repositories. It's, so yeah, like Naomi said in previous talk, it's good when you have very common folder structure. You understand where to find the entities, where to find the repositories. Rails has the same. It has folder controllers, models. So when you want to find model, you go to the folder model. But I find this approach a little bit tricky, and you trick yourself. You think that it is like a good thing to find the common code, but it's better to think in context. So DDD term, yeah, it's a bounded context or something. So let's imagine that you need to add or remove some module of the application, and it's or you need to understand how modules and repositories, how entities communicate with each other, and what are related to each other and what are not related. And at the right side, you see folder structure of Phoenix. It has also library, but it's Phoenix says you need to create a context, like accounts or feeds. And I said, okay, I have account and profile is a part of some accounts. Comments, feeds, and posts are part of some feed context. And you can see that this context is kind of wrapping similar or related functionality. So when you have a really huge application, when you have hundreds of entities, models, and operations, so currently we have the left one structure. And believe me, it's just, I don't know, it's awful. You're opening your entities or operations folder, and you see these hundreds of operations, and you need to understand what are really related. So we are, yeah, of course, putting them in the folders, but it would be ideally if framework would also emphasize on this structurizing your code. Okay, so trying to summarize everything that I have said. So my resolution is that Hanami is actually suitable, and it's possible to write small and bigger apps. So smaller apps when you do like small services, bigger apps in general. Unfortunately, batteries are not included, so almost everything that you would need to make by yourself, by your hands, or somehow connect it, to glue it together to Hanami. You wouldn't find a lot of docs how to do it. Hopefully with Hanami Cookbook you would find. There are not so much gems that are compatible with Hanami or specially has documentation how to connect to Hanami from Ruby. But I see that in a couple of years, in some gems, it really appears in notifications like how to deal with Hanami and this gem. You would need for sure to write much more code. And it's not bad, really. For my understanding, it's even better sometimes when you write code and you control how code works. And the better thing is that it's you are adjusting the framework, but not the framework adjusts you. So you can really change how you want to build your app, and not to struggle, for example, how you need to struggle when you use Trailblazer and Rails, for example, because when you start doing something not Rails way, you would start struggling and understand that it doesn't work as expected, as easy as expected. With Hanami, it's quite narrow, like quite straight. So if you do not change anything, it works. So it requires a moderate amount of time to do this, and if you want to change it, it still requires the same moderate amount of time to do this. So there is no very fast way, but there wouldn't be very tough way. But with Rails, I frequently got this. And so is it a good choice or not? It's a good choice for non-CRUD application for sure, with complex domains, as actually we have. It's good for APIs. You wouldn't notice any bad things. Good for services, and maybe not web UI applications. For more standard CRUD applications, for sure Rails would be a 100% winners. So that's not the question. So, and motivational thing, like Hanami is not perfect, but for sure it deserves that you to try this, at least not in production, but at least for your pet project. And that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We out of the time for Q&A, so if anybody have any question, you can speak to speaker directly afterward. And now, like 5 minutes